Welcome back to Misguided the Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and today I'm joined by physicist and author David Robert Grimes. David's career spans medical physics and cancer research, statistics, public health, and science communication, along with a past life in music and acting. In this conversation, we dig into why the just give people more facts approach falls short, how conspiracies take hold, and what effective media literacy really looks like. We also talk about the social and structural forces that shape health far more than any single hack. Also, why changing our mind should be seen as a strength, and how to rebuild trust in institutions without simply demanding it. Let's dive into our conversation. David, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to talk to you and meet you and explore all the really cool things you've been doing over the years. And before we dive into some of your most recent work with science communication and critical thinking, I'm curious if you could just share more about your journey and how you got into science, because my understanding is you did some acting and music, and how did that turn into medical physics?
So all I'll say is my career path has always been haphazard and confused. And that actually could be the story of my life. I did, as an undergrad, I studied physics. I almost studied law and then somehow decided that law sounded terrible and then went into physics instead. Didn't really think about it, just thought, that's interesting. I'll play with that. I like doing maths, so I guess that's why I did that. Or as the Americans say, math, I think singular, but we say maths over here. Anyway, ended up in university, was offered a PhD in medical physics, like looking at radiation dose modeling or non-ionizing radiation dose modeling. Found that really interesting. Ended up postdocing into cancer research and then into science communication. But the whole time through college, I was supporting myself with acting gigs, which that's still a passion of mine. I mean, obviously, I have friends who went professional, and some of them who are well known, and they're great. But I didn't have the to go that way, so I stayed doing music and acting as a hobby, and I still do it, and I love it. But yeah, the science became a career path, although I always joke that as an academic career path, it's about as unstable as a career in the arts. So I might as well have gone either way in the end.
So I guess when you pursued, like, your background was looking at cancer research, like how did you focus more on that specific for medical physics and math and all that stuff? Like did you start more topically or more the methods of math and physics and stuff like that?
So methods are really important. So I always joke, I'm not really medical physics. My PhD was partly medical physics, but it was never something I practiced. It was just a mathematical question about how do we get a dose that's beneficial for a patient without inducing cancer or minimizing the chances of inducing cancer. And that's a classic minimization problem, if you want to put the really nerdy slant on it. But my real interest was using mathematics and physical methods to answer medical questions. So when I moved to Oxford to do cancer research with Mike Partridge, my old professor, a brilliant man, he was originally a physicist as well, and he'd been in cancer research for years. And the idea was, we were looking at radiotherapy and what can we do to improve it? What can we do? What do we know about how tumors grow? How they use oxygen, things like that, that we could apply these methods to that might actually help patients. So I've always been really fascinated by solving problems. And what I do is I have this nice arsenal of different tools. I'm a chartered statistician as well, so I have statistics tools and I have mathematics tools, and I have a little bit of physical intuition. And whether it's public health, which I do a lot of now, or vaccine research or cancer research, they're all very disparate problems, but you can use very similar tools to try and shed light on those problems. So I work a lot with medics, with oncologists, with clinicians of different types, with public health doctors. And they'll say, look, I mean, let's say with public health, how do we vaccinate the most amount of people in a certain time? And I'm like, there's a branch of maths for that. And that's really what I like doing. It's coming at medical problems from a slightly different angle. But the reason, to answer your question, you get a similar set of tools. And even though the problems are very different in their scope and their application, there's underlying mathematical and physical truths that you can map from one to the other. And that was, I guess, I think that's probably what drove me to physics when I was undergrad, that it gave you a passport to do a lot more than just physics. Because I would be a terrible physicist. I guess as a jobbing physicist, I would suck because I'm only really interested in medicine. But I'm very interested in using mathematics to help medicine.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really interesting connection. So in your academic work, you're bridging, math and the medical world. And I'm curious how that translated then into your science outreach, science communication. Was that always an interest of yours? Or as you were doing
your PhD and postdoctoral work? Was that something that kind of evolved over time, seeing, all the pseudoscience out there? Or was there one particular thing that got you interested in doing that?
There's a few things that kind of triggered it. And again, like I said, haphazard and disorganized would be the story of my life. This is a chaotic, non-optimized system. But what I would say is that I mean, I guess maybe the theater or maybe the fact I was big into English literature and things like that. Communication was always something that I found relatively intuitive, and I was always very good at repackaging concepts for people in ways they could understand.
Mhm.
Even when I was, still doing a PhD and I was teaching or demonstrating, I found that I was pretty good at that. But what I started noticing, and I started off with a mistake, and a mistake a lot of people in science communication make. I started off in my head with an information deficit model of the world. I realized I was incredibly privileged to get the education I was getting and the opportunities I was getting. And I naively, around the age of 24, 25, I naively assumed that if we just gave people more information and clearer information, better decisions would be made. And that is partially true, right? But that's the information deficit model where people just don't have enough information. But this is before the rise of social media to the extent that it now dominates. We now realize that the opposite problem is partially true, that too much information makes it impossible to parse. People don't respond to messaging in a fully intellectualized way. I mean, obviously you've written about this. I've written a book about this as well. People, they there's a lot of an emotional component. So I started doing outreach work, just writing pieces because occasionally journalists would hear me say something and go, "Can you explain that? Like that's really easy explanation. Can you write something?" But I would get the feedback from people. People like would read the piece online, or to say it was in the Guardian or whatever else, and they'd write horrific things underneath it that really showed me, and it made me really fascinated, particularly with conspiracy theories. They were particularly obsessed with the notion that if I wrote something, say, pro-vaccines or pro-nuclear energy or fluoridation, that I was obviously a vested interest of some weird, and they had a weird conspiracy in their mind about it. And that got me really interested in studying the mathematics of how conspiracies would work. And spoiler alert, I did a paper on this in 2016. It went viral. They wouldn't. It turns out even if you want big conspiracies to last, it's just really hard to do for a whole load of, nice mathematical reasons. But that back and forth and realizing that my model, that this is just information deficit problem, was wrong. And then I got really interested. Well, what is correct here? And it turns out that human psychology is a massive factor in this. We don't just interpret messages in a dispassionate, intellectualized, homo economist kind of way. All the information we get, we parse through our own emotional filters, our own ideological worldviews. And we have a nasty tendency to, confirmation bias and motivated reasoning where we will bend things to fit our worldview. So I've now gone back to the idea that if we can just, in some ways, get the spirit of science in there, and that is scientific inquiry, that we are willing to change our worldview or change our ideas, but then we have to divorce ourselves from our ideas. The problem is, for a lot of us, our ideas become ourselves. Like the silly example I always give is, you support your local football team, you love your local football team, and someone goes, "Those guys suck." Why do you feel personally offended when they say that? Because you've put emotional capital and intellectual capital into identifying with that banner. Ideas are not a million miles off. We get very passionate about our ideas. We shouldn't. We should be promiscuous with our ideas and willing to discard them at a moment's notice if a better idea comes along. But that's not how we've been, cognitively built. So that's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I had a similar journey of grappling with the information deficit and just thinking that, oh, if only I could just give clearer and more concise scientific knowledge to people, that would help. And I think there is a bit of a journey of seeing that learning curve. And yeah, so much of it is filtered through the lens of identity. That's a big part of my work, is understanding how these identity processes influence us and how we can understand them. So I'm curious, as you've been in this space for a while, I think you wrote your book in 2019, if I'm correct? The
Yeah,
first
yeah.
the first, edition?
The first
So
edition, and I'm now working on another book or not. You know the joy of it.
I do, the
The
joy,
world is burning, and you're trying to get deadlines done.
I know, it's a surreal experience. Um, so I'm curious, like, your thoughts on the evolution of this space, because, like, we've seen, you know there are so many problems in the misinformation, broadly speaking, that world of pseudoscience and misinformation and conspiracism, 10, 20 years ago. And now it seems like in some ways it's gotten worse. There's also been more attention to it. So I'm just curious, any insights that you want to share of like the last 10 years or so being in this space? Have you seen good things or bad things or changes in a meaningful way?
So I wear two hats in this because I'm still very much an academic who researches this stuff. I always think like I do science communication as an outreach thing, but I'm technically just a scientist who is okay at communicating. But what I have noticed is this, and I am, and honestly sound Cassandra like, but at the end of my book, when I was writing about it, and I actually said at the beginning as well, I go, this is going to get a lot worse. So I wrote this before the pandemic.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote, the problems we're discussing here are going to get a lot worse. And I remember an editor going to me, yeah, but like we're getting better. So like, is that not a bit negative? And I said, okay, I will justify that statement because it is going to get a lot worse. The same editor rang me just like 3 months into the pandemic and went, I think you were right. And I said, I know. But the reason why, and this is really important to realize, the signs have always been there. This is going to get worse. And we're not at the zenith or the nadir, depending on how you define it here, of what the worst will be. We have been overwhelmed with information that we are particularly bad at parsing. We are particularly interested in information that makes us angry, information that makes us react, solicits some kind of visceral reaction. However, we're very bad at asking the fundamental questions of that information. Where did that come from? Is it reliable? Is it in context? Has it been framed in such a way as it's trying to provoke an emotive reaction rather than a rational one, right? So we have social media, which is absolutely basting us with this stuff. And we don't have the critical thinking skills and tools yet as a society to not be affected by that. We have terrible information hygiene, all that kind of stuff. But the seeds of that were very clearly sown, I think, years ago. I remember being in 2016 when that conspiracy paper went viral. I was on BBC. And it was by conspiracy theorists. And the hosts of a show asked me at one stage, conspiracy theories, though, it's a minority thing, isn't it? It's all these weird people that live in their mother's basements and wear tinfoil hats. And I was like, well, look, the data would suggest that about a quarter of the population, roughly, are susceptible to conspiratorial ideation, which is, that they will call to conspiracies as an explanation, even when more mundane explanations are possible. That's a very simple, hand-wavy version that Matthew can definitely correct better. But I said, if a quarter of the populations are susceptible to that, I said, well, then conspiracy theorists are your brothers, your mothers, your cousins, your friends. And again, those seeds were always there. We saw politically, in the 2016 election, that was absolutely dominated by disinformation and people falling for that. And again, the pandemic, I think, has laid it bare. We currently live, we're recording this in 2025, where Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is somehow the Human Health and Sciences Secretary, right? We are not at the worst of it yet, but it's all symptomatic of the same problem, that we have a terrible ability as a society to parse being overwhelmed with bad information. And we fail at those basic critical thinking skills, and it has allowed bad actors to bring us to where we are. So that, as the evolution of that space, it's all gotten worse, but the prognosis was always that it would get worse. I don't think we should be shocked by that. I think we should be shocked at how poorly prepared governments have been for this, how poorly prepared learned institutions. I mean, every week I'm advising, different learned bodies who don't seem to realize how much of a problem this is. They'll go, oh, but people won't misunderstand that. And I said, they won't have to. It will be misunderstood for them. I go, you have to be on guard for how this information will be understood. At the moment, you're on the back foot. So we still have a very reactive rather than proactive approach to misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, I completely co-sign with all of that. I've been having a lot of the similar thoughts as I've also saw a lot of this coming and getting worse with time. You speak of like mathematical modeling, there's probably some papers that you might have seen about just even the asymmetry in misinformation on social media compared to factual information, and just like mapping out how it would go over time and how the network clusters of the misinformation would dominate because they're so emotional, so viral, and then the factual ones kind of are insular, don't really spread as well.
And the big famous one of that was in 2015. I think it was Walter's, I can't remember his surname. There was a paper on that literally looked at that, and people said it was being pessimistic. And I remember reading that paper going, I think he's being optimistic.
Yeah, right. Like, if anything, some of those papers were underestimating how quickly this would happen and the scale. So it's really unfortunate. And yeah, I was thinking the same thing during the pandemic. I was just like depressed, but also not completely surprised by the lack of institutional preparedness and the lack of investment in communications and social science. And here in the United States, there were people that admitted that after the fact. I think Francis Collins, the leader of the NIH at the time, was saying, "Oh, we didn't think that." There'd be so many people that were against the vaccine, and maybe
You
we
could have
should have
just
like
stopped
spent.
that we didn't think. We
Yeah.
didn't think, and end the sentence there.
Well, yeah, it's just like there's this lack of incentives. There's this whole like macro discussion of like why that's the case and why we don't incentivize science communication, science outreach, and how it is this always like reacting instead of being proactive. And now we're to the point where, yeah, universities are being attacked very aggressively in a way we haven't seen in the States for a while. And research funding is cut in a way that's so much more extensive and at scale. And now finally universities here are like, oh, maybe we should actually be more proactive and learn how the communication landscape works in this digital age and this AI age. And it's like, okay, great. We're finally, it's like, are we always destined to be this as humans? I wonder, of like cycles of boom and bust, of things get good and then we forget about being thoughtful and proactive. And then we wait until they get bad and then we try to fix them. I just wonder if we could ever break that cycle.
I think, weirdly enough, I think there's a philosophical answer to it in some ways, and it just popped to my head there. And I mean, I've mentioned it before, but I always think of Popper's paradox of tolerance, right?
Uh-huh.
And this was, you probably know this well, but I'll say it to listeners who don't. He was writing after the fall of Nazism, and he'd lived through it, and he'd had to flee and everything else. And he was saying, what happens to a society? We want to be open-minded and tolerate everything. We want to be liberal and progressive. But what happens if you have a set of actors in there who are willing to undermine that? How long do you tolerate them? And his argument was, if you tolerate intolerance in a society, in this case, in his model, they will eventually come to dominate. And therefore, your entire tolerance. So he said, actually, you should resist, say, fascist views or things like. Even if you can be tolerant, but you should still have to reject, things that would undermine that tolerance. I think we have a similar parallel with information. I think we have a thing where we always, and this goes back to the fault of the information deficit model, we always have more information is always better. But if information or actors putting out information are putting out poisonous stuff there, if you get a vat of wine, right, and you add 1 cup of poison to it, you've just poisoned the wine. You haven't suddenly got like mainly okay wine, right? And I think information is similar. And again, we have a problem where we have our social media echo chambers, but we also have, you have things like Joe Rogan, 100 million listeners, right? You have people like that platforming the worst people. And the defense is always, oh, we're just listening to alternative points of view. And I'm like, but you're not, though. That's an advocacy without any pushback, without any editorialization. For example, Joe Rogan, whatever if you like him, don't like him, I'm picking him for example. I could pick on Charlie Kirk. I would love to pick on Charlie Kirk. I could pick on any of these guys, right? But they all do the same thing. Like, well, just asking questions. I go, but you're not qualified to ask the question, right? You're not a good interlocutor because you don't push back and go, sorry, where did you get that information from? A good TV host or good radio host, for all the flaws of it, their job is actually to push back. If they have a politician on their show and the politician makes a bunch of statements, they should be, if they're doing their job correctly, going, I'm sorry, that's not actually correct, or how can you justify that statement? They're supposed to probe. But we've gone into the all information is entertainment phase of existence, where people will listen to a podcast and think they've learned something because, they heard something about vaccines on it. I'm like, you probably didn't, though. It's unlikely you learned anything from that. And then people, are appalled by that. Like, but I spent like 3 hours listening to that. I'm like, yes, and you probably learned nothing. If anything, you probably polluted your information source. You've added poison to your wine. And because you don't have the skills or the wherewithal to parse that and to play that like skeptical agent, you're now disinformed. So it goes back to that weird parallel to the paradox of tolerance. We've allowed bad actors absolutely overwhelmed. And this is not a defense of traditional media. Like in many ways, that was failing for years. But the one thing that we should give them credit for is that most journalistic organizations have some modicum of fact checking, have some modicum of journalistic standards and integrity. We've thrown that by the wayside and saw it as freedom. And actually, it's imprisoned us. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, it's definitely been concerning to see this most recent wave of podcasting hosting all types of people without any pushback. And And that's been something that, again, maybe this is overcorrection of some of the issues with traditional media, where then people go to independent media and the openness that comes with this. And then we become so open that we just let whoever is on there say whatever without any pushback. And I then wonder if there's going to be more correction to that, where instead of just hosting, whoever who's spreading all kinds of lies or whatever agenda they have, and you just have them on there because they're controversial, it's like getting to the point now where people are like, oh, at least some audience members of like Joe Rogan are like, maybe you should push back whenever you have, the FBI director on your platform, instead of just letting them say whatever. Like, you're just being used as a political tool at that point.
Yeah. But that requires a savviness on the part of listenership. And this is not, I have to phrase this carefully because if I do it wrong, it'll sound snobby. And it's not what I mean. What I mean is the skills you need to critically parse information, they're not intuitive. They have to be trained in. So we have to learn from an early age to go, hang on, what question should be asked there? So in Finland, they started doing this very, very earlier on. They're teaching kids media literacy.
Uh-huh.
And the idea is, but they do it as an exercise. And they're going, look, and they start very young. I think the age of 6-ish, doing this. It turns out that Finland, for that reason, is a country that has much higher trust in traditional media institutions because it knows that people learn very early on something about fact checking, something about journalistic obligations and integrity. Your job, like if, you're right, if you're the Joe Rogan, if you were actually a journalist, your job would be to push back when people make a claim, or at least ask for clarification and go, sorry, you've said this. Is this true? Where did you get it from? The hard questions, as we used to call them back in the day. I make myself feel very old saying that. But it requires training and understanding to know why we ask those questions. It's not just to be pedantic. It's so that we don't get taken for a ride by bad actors. The problem starts in our education system from day one. We don't teach media literacy. Look, adult literacy, full stop. Now, I can't speak for the States, but I know in Ireland, which is a very highly educated country, about 23% of our population will struggle to read the directions on a packet of aspirin. All right? When you go into and that's basic literacy. When you go into greater forms of literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, the adult literacy goes way down. So for media literacy in Europe, it's about 50% of people are media literate, meaning 50% aren't, right? Depending on what country, it varies a bit, but it's usually around there. So for example, I will know that something that's in the New York Times is probably more reliable than something on my racist uncle's Facebook page. A lot of people won't. Now, I don't actually have a racist uncle. That's very mean, but it's the analogy I see. I mean, when the alt-right stuff gets shared, it's if you don't know the difference between source integrity, you're going to get taken advantage of. So we need to be training people from day one, from our education system. The only way we can immunize ourselves against this stuff is that we have to start really early going, look, there are people online and offline who will take advantage of you, who will feed you a diet of nonsense to make you pliable, to make you buy stuff, to make you scared because it gets their profit. Here are the tricks you can ask, not to be like cynical and just dismiss everything, but here when you hear information is probably how you should stop and wait and think and analyze it. So I think that that's a massive gap in our system that I see it in Europe and I see it in the States when I'm over there as well. We need to look at media and digital literacy. And at the moment, we struggle with basic adult literacy, which is a real problem. It means you've underinvested hugely in our educational systems. And I think there's a huge argument that we need to go right back to the drawing board and make sure that everyone is protected against this stuff, immunized against this information that will harm them and harm their society in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been studying media literacy and working on different games and tools and pre-bunking stuff to try to get that at scale. But like, even if you develop some nice game that helps people learn media literacy online, it's a tiny drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the ocean compared to the waves of disinformation and misleading content online. So I always think, like, how do we do this at scale? Like, and you're right, like, ultimately starting with the education system and the public education system, and having curriculum where there's media and digital literacy built in, instead of like after the fact trying to push these games or tools out to people who, may not click on them if they're not interested in media literacy. It's always like, how do you reach the people who need
Who need it
to
the
get
most?
those schools? Yeah.
And
That's
because
always,
all of
yeah.
us And what I always say, sometimes the cynical argument you hear from people, and you used to occasionally hear it years ago, and I always hated it back then, was, "What do you care if some people are, idiots?" So firstly, I don't think they're idiots, right? I
Mhm.
think they're unfortunate. They've been misled on things. But I always point out that that's like saying, "What do you care if some people have this disease?" We all live in a society. We all
Mhm.
vote, right? We all shape the future for ourselves and our children and everything else. So it's not enough just to dismiss people like, "Oh, those people are silly," or if that's a polite way of saying it, people say much worse. I'm like, we need to understand why, and we have to realize that these aren't just people that we can dismiss as being fools. These people have been taken advantage of. They've been exploited. They've been manipulated. They've been misled, and because of that, they are likely to do harm. This goes back to the fact that we and this is why the libertarian model has never worked for me. We all are part of a society. No one works in isolation.
Mhm.
So, years ago, it was a tinfoil hats in the basement thing. We used to laugh at. I'm like, well, actually, we're all interconnected. And if people have, it's like a disease outbreak. If a outbreak of people, I love the term viral disinformation because I think in a lot of ways, and I work a lot with, you probably know Sander van der Linden,
Mhm.
like him and I work a bit like that. And I think it's a great term because actually it does transmit. You can infect people with falsehood, and they can be infected by it, innocent people, and they can make terrible decisions about their well-being. I work mainly in the health space, so I
Mhm.
usually see it in terms of health. I mean, I've dealt with patients who have died because they've gone down the road of believing something they read on a Facebook post or on a TikTok. I mean, I wish I'd say I've only seen it a few times. I've seen that like over 10 years. I'd say I've seen it about 100 times. And it's
Oh,
horrific, So you can't just dismiss people as being idiots. People are scared, they're vulnerable, they're looking for information, but if they don't know how to look in the right places, and they don't realize that there's bad actors who will manipulate them, and they don't know what questions to ask, they're vulnerable. So we should be looking to places like Finland and going, what can we do early on? Because if you learn these skills early on, and Matthew, you obviously have them brilliantly. I mean, this is bread and butter to you, right? But it's to say it becomes much less effort if these skills are intuitive to you. Like you've learnt them so early. Like if I read a newspaper article now, even in a reputable newspaper, I will often be like, has the journalist properly understood that topic? Have they asked the right questions of the sources they're quoting? Have
right.
they shown due skepticism and due fact checking on the back of it as well, right? And sometimes they fall short and you can see and go, well, that was bad. But it's become so natural that you don't think about it. If I read a post online, I'm like, okay, that's wrong. I know what source to look at and I can check it. There's a disparity there. They're obviously doing this for rage bait or clickbait, whatever else. And I can dismiss them entirely from then. But if you don't know that stuff, how would you ever parse it? Like the most common comment I get on Instagram and Twitter and things is people, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what
Right.
to believe. And that's a problem because we live in a society that's only going to become more overwhelming, particularly as AI generated slop and disinformation starts to feed into the already terrible amount of disinformation we had. So we needed those skills like yesterday, but we definitely need them now.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I've been trying to do my part in sharing these skills with as many people as I can. And I think, one of the big challenges is then also addressing those other social and emotional factors that influence why people are susceptible to these falsehoods. So it's the critical thinking skills and the deficit of critical thinking skills, but then also the I often think about the needs that a lot of this health misinformation can provide people
Mm.
in terms of feeling a sense of control and agency. And I was curious if your thoughts on this of how science communicators could do a better job of providing that sort of agency. And like I've been thinking a lot about how even the term like do your own research is now like a pejorative, like, oh, they don't really know how to do their own research. But really what I think's behind a lot of that is this sense of agency of I took control over my health, for example, and I was the person who sought this out. And that's why I feel personally connected to this information. And in comparison, if they're just reading about some health guideline from a medical organization that's just telling them you should do this, it doesn't feel as personal. They don't feel as in
Yeah.
control of it. So I'm like curious, like how do we navigate that emotional agency need of control that can somehow be disconnected from health information, reputable health information. Whereas like we have this like human need where we want to feel like we're the ones actually doing the stuff and feel personally connected to it.
Of course. So the first thing I'd say is, I mean, I understand that urge, but I mean, I'm someone who knows a fair bit about medicine from what I do. But when I get sick, I go talk to a doctor, right?
Mhm,
And I don't tell them what to do. I suggest and have a conversation with them. I've read something. What about that? But they have it. When my car is damaged, I might know a bit about like how a catalytic converter works, an engine or something, but I go to the mechanic, right?
mhm,
I might know what I want my house to look like, but I get a carpenter in to do wood on it. I don't try to do it myself, right? Because we realize, at least intuitively in most situations, that we can have some age difference, but the people, the experts in those fields, the reason we pay them well and we go and solicit their advice is because they actually know more than us. They know more than us watching a few TikTok. So firstly, we need to stop denigrating expertise. Because you know what? That you watch 3 TikTok videos does not a medical degree make, right? And this is not to put people down. This is the reality of it. The subjects that I think I know until I go and speak to people who really know them. And I walk away going, yep, I don't know that at all. That person is so much better informed than me, right? And that's okay. We're not experts in everything. So the first thing is to realize that no one's trying to do you out of stuff. So a lot of it is I took control of my own health narrative is because, and you'll see it a lot, the most common forms of health disinformation start with, here's what doctors don't want you to know.
mhm,
Well, why would a doctor not want you to know that? Of course they would, if it was true. But what you're doing is you're setting up a narrative to put you at odds with the experts that are trying to guide your healthcare and trying to help you, right? So the first thing is that agency is working with experts, is working with your medical team. It's not like
mhm,
working against them. And you can be proactive. I think it's really good when patients go, hey, doctor, I read this. In my experience, particularly in cancer research, the amount of patients go, I saw a video about vitamin C or this or whatever. What do you think? And a good oncologist would go, look, that's really interesting. You read about that, but the studies wouldn't support that, you know?
mhm.
And then they go, okay, cool. And then they've been proactive. But it's not like they're going to suddenly discover something and the oncologist will slap his forehead and go, Eureka, why did I never think of that?
Right.
You know, that's one thing. But the other thing is that determinants of health, and I think this, I might lose an American audience on this because I go very socialist on this, but it's true. The amount of your health that you control, you know, as in things that you do, that you can, the levers you can pull for your own health constitute about 20 to 30% of your total health outcomes. The other 70% are genetic, institutional, environmental, and hugely socioeconomic. The
Mhm,
biggest predictor of how your health is going to turn out is the postcode you were born in, because that tells you how rich you were, right?
right.
It's why America spends way much more on healthcare than Europe does and has way worse health outcomes, even for the richest people. The average American dies at 79. The average Brit dies at 85, right? And again, you're spending 4 times as much in healthcare. That is because the determinants of health are socioeconomic and they are psychosocial. They are complicated. So this idea that we're like, I'll take control of my health, I optimized, seems to forget that healthcare doesn't occur in a vacuum, that the well-being doesn't occur in a vacuum, that things are interlinked. If you don't have, say, good primary care, or people in your society can't afford it, or there's environmental, lack of regulation that's making people sick, you can spend all the money you want on healthcare or look up all the videos on TikTok. You're still going to die younger.
Mhm,
And again, this is really powerful if you look at this. If you see maps of the States, I was at a talk recently where I watched a professor who's Irish, but he works in the States in public health, and he showed an area in down in this. I won't name the state because you might work out here, but in a single area separated just by 8 miles in the same city, the life expectancy in one area was 65, and another was 82. Right? And he goes 8 miles away. These are different stories. And that's a problem because what that's showing you is there's massive inequality. Systemic inequality is bad for healthcare in general. But this kind of libertarian model that we can optimize our health, we can choose our health, it is the most middle class bloody thing I've ever heard. Right? Because if you want to optimize health, get poorest people out of poverty and get them good healthcare, you'll improve all society, even the richest well-being. And that blows people's minds. But I'm like, it's a system. It's like there's no magical formula that you can just apply to you. You have to apply it to a system. And I think it's really hard for people to understand intuitively, particularly
mhm.
in a very individualistic society like the US is, where,
Right.
it's all about me, 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 and my. But I mean, the joke is, sure, America was set up on tax avoidance. So, this libertarian mindset runs deep.
It
But
does.
It's behind a lot of health disinformation. The idea that you can somehow optimize, and I hate that term, your health, when most of the determinants of health are way beyond an individual's control.
Yeah, that's so spot on. So I appreciate you sharing that because that's certainly been, weaponized in our most recent health leadership
Yeah.
of, focusing on individual actions and then ignoring all these social determinants of health and, making these these changes of, you know, French fries are fried in seed oils versus beef tallow as if this could have any meaningful impact on health. But it's frustrating to see that focus on these things that are not going to have tangible health
Of
outcomes
course.
and not any focus on what you speak to, this like 70% that even, the social components of it that we could actually change. Like, even if we're still trying to understand how genes and stuff influence our health, we can at least, we see, like you see, the zip codes having such a strong impact. So I'd like to see the United States get to a point where we can at least have those types of conversations and have policy changes that could hopefully make a positive change in our public
Now,
health.
I should be clear. I'm not just singling out the States as a punching bag here. It feels like having a hard enough time. I don't want to put that in there because this has crept into Europe too. Even though Europe has mainly socialized medicine, you still have it. Now, we see the class distinction a bit more because I will see people sharing, they'll send me a link to a video on Instagram and they go, "Is this true?" And it's always someone saying that you do this, you'll optimize your health. And I joke that it's the most middle class thing I can see because you have to be fairly wealthy and well off to care about optimizing your health, right?
Mhm,
To be able to spend sometimes several hundred quid a month on snake oil means
mhm.
you're usually pretty healthy already, or you've had all the socioeconomic advantages that allow you to squander your money on nonsense. Where I go, if you actually look even in Europe at the distribution of areas of where poverty is very high, you have much earlier death as well. So it's not just an American problem. It's just America has a uniquely libertarian mindset to it and doesn't have any public health. Well, it does have some public health, but
Yeah,
it has less socialized health than most of Europe.
yeah, we're constantly defunding any efforts for public health, but it's such a tough time at the moment. So I'll try to challenge you with find some where's some optimism in this space. If people are looking for, okay, like what are some ways that we can move forward? I know you we've been talking about how it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
And it will, but that's not necessarily this is like, when you first realize you're sick, look, your fever's gonna get higher and spike before it
Hmm.
breaks, right? There is some optimism, I would say. And this is a weird kind of optimism, but I would say that for years we did not recognize this problem. I know obviously you have been saying it for a while, and I've been sounding alarm
Hmm.
bells for 10 years over this. But people would say it was alarmist 10 years ago. They'd be like, "Oh,
Right.
it's not it's a minority sport. It's only 5% of people." They would look, for
Hmm.
example, the classic one is they'd look at the amount of people that always avoid vaccination, and it's been 3 and 5% in most countries. And they
Right.
go, "Well, that's your problem." And I'm like, "But that's contagious." And they're like, "No, it's not. It's always consistent." I'm like, "You have no idea what's coming down the road." The thing is, I remember actually sitting this at a panel meeting that I was on about 8 years ago, and there was someone from Public Health England, and I was talking about anti-vaccine disinformation online, which I do a lot of work on. And they were like, "No, that's not a big deal because not that many parents use Facebook or whatever else." And I was just
Mm.
like, "But it is a big deal." And like, I'd love to find that executive now and go, "What do you think is happening?" Um, but here's the thing: we didn't take the problem seriously, and we said at the beginning of this recording that, like, institutions are still struggling to deal with it, governments are still struggling to deal with it, but now we can't deny it. So it's like
Mhm.
kind of, the bad analogy here is, hitting your rock bottom to realize you have a problem.
Mhm.
This should be our rock bottom moment where we go, as a society, as a collective, no, not again. I go, we cannot live in a world where bad actors can manipulate politics, they can manipulate society based on a few viral disinformation videos. We need to be on our guard for that. What are we going to do? And you're right, there's no magic bullet, there's no silver solution, but there are things we can do that long term will immunize us against that. That's things like, bringing in media literacy education very early on, encouraging critical thinking in school, and also being more honest about when we get things wrong. Because
Yeah.
that's one thing I say. I mean, I say it in the book constantly, and I say it in life constantly. There is no shame in being wrong. There's only shame in refusing to update your worldview when it is shown the belief you had is no longer viable. right? This is where we divorce our emotions from our ideas. I often go into something like, and I'm very lucky in my job. I'm surrounded by people a lot smarter than me. And we're all opinionated. I'll often come in with an opinion. And I'll go, hey, I think this. And I think I've really thought this out. And someone just quietly devastates it. They pick away at it and go, no, actually, that wouldn't work though, would it? Because this, that, and other. And I'm left there feeling, oh, yeah, that's not right at all. And it's really easy to get humiliated by that feeling. But I've redirected myself over many years. Instead of getting humiliated, I get a little bit euphoric because suddenly that person has tempered by fire me towards a better idea. They've stopped me wasting time in a bad idea. And as long as you don't emotionally put yourself into that idea and identify and say, this is the rock I will die on, you will always be able to refine it. And I think that's really liberating. So I think the reframing of the education thing, and the other thing I say is, can we suddenly make changing our mind a liberating thing? A thing that we do that actually everyone should high five us and go, you're doing awesome. Instead of being seen as a weakness, it should be seen as a strength. If someone comes in with a better argument, you go, well, I'm convinced. That's good. That's how it should work. But that's still not normal to us. Even politicians, they hate. I would be more inclined to vote for politicians that I used to have this policy, but I've talked to experts, I've learned a bit, and I honestly think that we need to change it. I'd be more inclined to vote for a politician who could say that than one that would just say, no, 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 this is always our policy, or it's always this, or never admits to being wrong, because actually we're always wrong. There's no shame in that. It's because information always changes. We should always be getting less wrong, not more wrong.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I hope that collectively we can update our cultural norms to celebrate admitting that you were wrong about something, or celebrate not knowing something and not having a strong opinion before you're well versed in it. And I do
Or,
think
or
that
can
people
can
are
I add one
yeah.
thing out here? Sorry,
Sure, yeah. Good.
because you've said it more eloquent than me, but can we also add not having an opinion?
Yeah.
Something that's really liberating is because social media in particular forces you, what do you think of this? Binarizes
Mhm.
things, polarizes things, which is really
Right.
unhealthy. And it misses nuance, destroys that. Sometimes the correct answer is, I actually don't know enough to have an opinion. But when I
Mhm.
read up a bit more on it, I'll get back to you, right? Someone said it to me a few months ago, and I wanted to shake their hand because it was such a perfect way of expressing, and it was a topic that was over here very important. It was in politics, but they wanted to go and read more on it before they had like a knee jerk opinion. And I just remember thinking, that is so not what we're conditioned to do, but it is exactly what we should be doing. Often just going, well, that looks bad on paper, but I actually don't know enough about it. So I'm going to read about it, and then I'll get back to you, and then I'll have an opinion. Or maybe I still won't have an opinion, but I'm going to at least get the information first independently of the channel that's trying to polarize me into having a strong point of view immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we're not always incentivized to do that too. I mean, that speaks to understanding some of those media literacy skills of how, as soon as we go on social media, we're only seeing the extremes because of how the algorithm works. But then also understanding how these platforms are incentivized to keep us on there as much as possible. So they're going to outrage us and get us upset, and try to be mindful of that when we use social media, I think is also really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, you said cause for optimism. I
Mhm.
think that there's a sea change in how governments, at least for the most part, well, maybe not the current American administration who've benefited from this, but hopefully when the Democrats get themselves out of whatever the hell they're doing at the moment, right? There is a thing where we have to realize, okay, we cannot go on like this. We cannot solve the problems the world faces when can't even agree on basic facts. Like,
Mhm.
everyone should be entitled to their own opinion, but no one should be entitled to their own facts. For example, take something like climate change. There's a million and one things we could do to address climate change. There's a compromise to have to be made all across the board for things like that, right? But if we can't even accept the reality of climate change, we're just going to suffer the worst possible outcomes. Whereas, someone might go, well, I believe in climate change, but I don't want to change this much. Well, there's a compromise. We could change X amount here, and we can make up the balance. But we can't even have those discussions if we can't all agree on basic facts. And we need to get to the point where we realize that basic facts should be beyond, what is sometimes called identity politics. I'm probably using wrong because you would know this better than me. But like, it needs to get out of the ideological bubbles. And let's face it, at the moment, there's only really one. But it could go either way. I'm keeping my mind open for it. But at the same time, we need to get there because this is not conducive. Where we are at the moment, highly polarized, can't even agree on basic reality is a problem. The spectrum of opinion is when policy comes in. You can have loads of policy opinions, and then you can find compromise solutions that fix them. But not if you can't agree on the problem. If you have alternative facts, as someone once said, we need to avoid that. We need to have the same facts and then go, the debate should be about what we do about that, not whether those facts are true or not.
Yeah, well put. And I think this provides an opportunity for us to rebuild our scientific institutions in a way that can connect with folks in a way that resonates with them. Again, like, paying more attention to communication, incentivizing communication, and trying to work directly with communities. That's something that I've been thinking a lot lately, is actually having universities and medical centers work with their local communities in a way that they feel there's less psychological distance between themselves and the experts, because that's so much of trust is a social connection. And if you don't know a lot of doctors or scientists and you don't speak to any of them, but yet someone on your TikTok is, directly speaking to you and answering your questions and concerns, like, of course it makes sense that you might trust them more, even though they don't have valid expertise. So
Yeah.
trying to understand those social components to getting good information out there to as many people as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that you know better than me, Matthew, is the fact that people are drawn to disinformation misinformation for different reasons, right?
Uh-huh.
Some of us, we just want, some kind of epistemic certainty. The world scares us, and the person that gives the simple answer with the least complication, that's really sexy. But I think it's really important that we all acknowledge and we come to embrace, not just acknowledge, that the world is really complicated. Most things have multiple factors. There's usually caveats and nuance. So anyone who's selling us a simple answer for things, generally, not always, but generally, is vastly oversimplifying or misleading us into the wrong thing.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that reductive cause thing we need to get away from. But I understand I always separate people who are like the propagators of misinformation versus the victims of misinformation, right?
Yeah.
I put them, you know, when people share misinformation, I don't always go, you're being villainous. Oftentimes they don't know better. They've heard this and they now believe it's true. And then there are other people that profiteer off it or do it for narcissistic reasons or whatever else. So I think it's really important to kind of, as you do and in the book and like you talk about, understanding and your research indeed the emotional aspects of how information appeals to us. And it's okay to acknowledge our feelings. I think it's really good to say, look, I want this to be true.
Okay.
I do myself now when I read a newspaper article that agrees with my perspective, I stop myself and go, I really want this to be true. So I have to check this twice as hard as I'd check it if it said the opposite. Because there's the thing where like, we can give a past information that seems to be of our worldview. When actually maybe the toughest interrogations we need to do is of our preconceptions. And sometimes you'll find them shifting.
Uh-huh.
And I say also, the idea that we can just convince people that we change other people's minds, I don't think that's true either. I say this in the book and I say this again. I think we sow seeds. I think no one has ever changed your mind. They've given you the tools and the freedom to arrive at better decisions, better
Uh-huh.
information. And I think we have to keep it like all we can do is sow seeds and go, look, here's a better, or not better. I often deal with vaccine hesitant parents, good example, or people who maybe won't be getting their chemotherapy because they've first online. And I know arguing with them isn't going to help. So what I'll do is I listen to what they're scared about. And often I'll go, look, I totally acknowledge where you're coming from. I go, and your concerns are valid. I go, but here's an idea. I just want you to hear me out. I said, I'm not trying to sell this to you. I said, I just want you to think about this to see if it describes things as well as your model or not. And just think about it. I go, blah, blah, blah. And I'll give whatever it is. And I'll say, I don't want you to go away and tell me which one you think is right or wrong. I just want you to think about it. Would that explain things better than what you read on that Twitter thread about new cancer cures? Like, would that matter? Well, I go, and again, I go, you can call me anytime, but just think about it because you're always planting seeds. You're not like people come change their mind in their own freedom when they feel free to do so. But again, we need to, normalize people changing their minds, including
Yeah,
us. I
absolutely.
don't let us off the hook on this. We're not savants. We often, as active researchers, you often find out you're gone down a whole road that's just not right. That's okay too. You know.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to, again, the social conditions. Like, we're both in bubbles where people celebrate this kind of changing your mind and being open to new evidence. So
Not
we
as much
have
as they
those.
should, Matthew, not as much as they should. You come into a work meeting and you say, "Hey, the thing we've been doing for the last 6 months doesn't work." You will find the ones that start pushing the heels in, you know?
Well, that's true, and I think that's also an important point. The human element of science is something that I think is worth mentioning. It's a broader discussion of like, we're humans doing this science too, and that's why we need this self-correcting institution that can push us towards truth. Because a lot of scientists will be biased to protect their own pet theories. Like if they build a career finding X equals Y or something, and someone says, "No, you didn't look at Z," they'll be like, "Well." It's personally attached to them, so they're human, and that's going to connect how
They
they.
are human, and I
Yeah.
have to say, to be fair, my other hat I wear, which I haven't mentioned yet, is I am a sleuth in residence for Retraction Watch. So I spend
Mhm.
an awful lot of time finding scientific papers that are fraudulent or faked or otherwise not reliable. So the idea that scientists are always perfect is wrong too. It's very wrong, but the scientific method is how we inquire and we find things out. So I often get asked by people, well, individual scientists can lie. Think about Andrew Wakefield or think about X, Y, or Z. I'm like, yes, they can, but it's scientists that catch them out.
Right.
And that doesn't make their behavior okay. But it's a scientific method that will find this stuff out. It's inquiry and skepticism. And again, it's no one is above that law, even scientists. They can't just go, I'm a scientist, trust me. No, I trust you based on the evidence. I don't trust you based on your say so.
Right. And I think that's one thing that I think more scientists and science communicators are trying to do a better job of avoiding that, trust me, bro, kind of top down messaging that doesn't seem to work very well. Like people really want to see you show your work whenever you're describing why you think vaccines are safer and effective, for example. Just saying get vaccinated and then leaving it at that it's probably not going to be very effective if someone's skeptical. So instead, actually walking them through the process and again, like providing that sense of agency and understanding of like, oh, I understand more about this process too. So it's a challenging path to walk, but I think it's critical that we at least try to incorporate these types of communication strategies in our work.
Absolutely, and the behavioral component is really important. And I mean, again, that's a lot into your work as well. But absolutely, and it is again, it goes back to the quod ego deco because I say so is not a very good model of
Mhm.
of putting science out there, particularly because science is often, I mean, evolving. It's often wrong. At the
Right.
beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a piece for the Irish Times where I said, look, because I kind of saw this coming, but again, not sure it did much good. I said, this is an emergent threat. We don't know much about it. A lot of the advice you get now is going to change. A lot of the things you're told about the virus will change. That's not science failing. That's science doing its job. That's science correctly updating itself as it gets more information. And yet a lot of people struggle with that. They were like, oh, well, scientists said 3 weeks ago we should do this. And now they're saying this. I said, yes, because in the 3 weeks interim, which is very quick for science, we learned something new about the transmission of COVID-19. So therefore we changed the advice about it.
Right.
So that's okay. But because people are still hold up the psychological model, well, you know, you, you can't change your mind. You should be changing your mind as the evidence emerges. And science is a great example of doing it. It's a systematic method of doing that. That's what it is. It's great.
Yeah, and it also speaks again to science literacy, media literacy, and how it's often taught again here in the States is you kind of like memorize facts sometimes. And it's just like, okay, we're learning about facts as science as like a series of conclusions and results. And there's less focus on that methodological process of how things change and evolve. And yeah, I think having classes, the first classes I got on this was really like graduate school, where I really learned into the method and really dove into that.
And you know what? One of the things I've noticed with scientists, I'm not to kick my fellow scientists here, but there is a kind of a snobbery about philosophy of science. So
Mm,
I will often say to scientific because again, I spend a lot of my time finding scientific fraud or scientifically invalid results, and often it's more wishful thinking. People have found a result where they only could have got there if they, crossed their fingers and tapped their little red shoes and said, "There's no place like home." And the reason why that happens is because they don't know the scientific method well enough, which is philosophical. It's like, look, you are trying to disprove your own work. You're trying to whittle away all explanations that alternative explanations say you're left with one that's the strongest. But people, like you said earlier on, people get their pet theories and they like, this is my
mhm.
favorite theory. And I keep pointing out to my students in particular, that's not a scientist's job. You go to the lab and you find a null result, that's high fives all around. I mean, yeah, Nature mightn't give you the paper on it because scientific publishing is all weird. But the fact that you find a drug doesn't work is every bit as important as knowing it does work. And it's far more important than falsely thinking it works. So I was like, you need to get back to our jobs here as scientists is to arrive at the closest to the explanation for events that we can, not to misguide ourselves and other people. And then again, when you see these bad results, you're like, did these people like ever study their Karl Popper? Did they ever go through their Thomas Kuhn? Who knows? They probably did not. I don't know.
Probably not. It's yeah, I don't know how many people take classes like that. Like I one of my favorite classes in graduate school was a philosophy of science class where we just learned about what are theories, how does that connect to methods, how do we know what we know, and I don't even know how popular or how common those types of classes are, even at the PhD level, let
They're
alone
not.
undergrad or high school.
I didn't do one. I just thought I remember thinking this, like, it's mad that I have a PhD and I'm only learning this because I'm just reading random books on it, and a lot of my colleagues
Yeah.
didn't. Because I mean, again, very early in my career when I started finding dodgy papers, and it was almost always people setting up an experiment in such a way that guaranteed they get a result,
Mhm.
and presumably because they didn't know any better. That their job was supposed to testing their idea, not just setting it up so their idea might look like it had some signal. And again, I think that philosophy, I mean, this is where I'm not disparaging all scientists, but we need to be very careful about our messaging too, and realizing that our messaging can often change because scientists are fallible, and that's okay.
Yeah,
But we're still
absolutely.
better than random people on TikTok telling you random stuff about cancer. I think we can be there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed our conversation. Where can people find you and your work?
Oh, I don't want people to find me. They'll make
Okay.
me do work. No, I'm kidding. You'll find me on Instagram, David_Robert_Grimes. On Twitter, the cursed platform at DRG1985. I'm on Blue Sky, which I never use, but I'm going to try to use it more. And my website is davidrobertgrimes.com. And if you're in the States, my book is called Good Thinking. What's the subtitle of it? Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk and How Critical Thinking Saved the World.
Mhm.
And in the rest of the world, it's called The Irrational Ape. But apparently, my American publishers were not happy with calling it an ape-related title when 43% of Americans don't believe in evolution. So
Huh.
that's why it was retitled. That was
I
not.
was curious about that. So
Yeah.
that's the backstory.
Well,
Okay.
they claimed that it was because Americans are like, "Oh, we like a more optimistic title." And I'm like, is this nothing to do with market research showing the fact that ape would be controversial for a human here? They never fully answered that, but I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. But yeah, so definitely check out those books and all of David's work. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our
My pleasure,
conversation.
Matthew. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.